Perfect. So I think we're good to get started. So welcome everyone. Welcome to Founder Fundamentals. So happy to see you all again. And we're happy to see so many new faces as well. In fact, if you're new and this is your first time attending in Founder Fundamentals, if you can type your name in the chat box, that would be great. So we can all give you a warm welcome. So this is actually the sixth event in the series now, which is hosted by LaunchU and the Markham Small Business Center. So my name is Diana Senwasain. I am the Marketing and Events Coordinator for LaunchU, which is the entrepreneurship unit at York University. Today's a bit of a special day because we are celebrating York University's Red and White Day. So this is York Spirit Day, and our entire team has been wearing red, white, or York gear to help celebrate this day. And this event is actually an official event as a part of the schedule of festivities. Now, I know that most of you already know this, but I just want to remind you that York has tons of programs and services to support entrepreneurs that are completely free and open to anyone worldwide. So if you're looking to start your journey or even continue your journey as an entrepreneur and need some support, LaunchU offers a number of free programs, events, and services to help take your venture to the next level. So we support not only students, but alumni and external community members as well. I do want to tell you about an exciting event that we have coming up in 2 weeks. And we actually held our first event in this series earlier today. So this event is a part of the Entrepreneurial Alumni Speaker Series at Home. And basically what we do with the event is invite really successful York University alumni to come back and share their story with audience members. So this event was previously an in-person event and we transformed it to a virtual event. So now it is accessible to anyone. So the next event that we have coming up in the series is in 2 weeks on November 12th, and it is featuring Rand Gohl. He is the founder of Fresh City Farms. So if you're interested in registering for that event, you can visit our website on launchu.ca/events. Now, this workshop series has really become a community staple, and it's designed to help aspiring entrepreneurs really build their skills to help launch their startup. This is the first time that LaunchU is hosting the series, so we're really excited to introduce it to audience members worldwide now that it's held virtually. In fact, I'm curious to know where all of you are joining us from today. So you know the drill. If you can type in your location in the chat box, and I'm going to share that with the audience members so we can see where everyone is joining us from today. So I see Ottawa, Vaughan, Etobicoke, Milton, Toronto, of course. We've got Hamilton. We've got someone from the UK. That's great. Mississauga, Oshawa. Anyone else from outside of Ontario or outside of Canada joining us today? Perfect. So it's so great to see so many of you from really all over the globe joining us today for this series. We feel really grateful that you're all joining us and able to share this experience with us today. So the 11 workshops in the series are really aimed to give you a hands-on approach, and they're led by industry experts, and hopefully they provide you with the resources that you can actually use. Now, most of you know that if you do attend at least 9 of the workshops in the series, that you will be getting a certificate of recognition, and this certificate will be given in December after our last session has ended. So there's nothing that you need to do. Zoom tracks your attendance, so there's no further action required on your part. I do want to mention that the series could not be possible with many people working behind the scenes. And I do want to acknowledge David Kwok, who is the Associate Director of Entrepreneurship at Innovation York. So David has worked really hard to source a lot of our speakers in the series as well as the topics, and he will be in the chat as well to help answer any questions. I would also like to take a moment to thank our partner, the Markham Small Business Center, for providing their support. And we have Linda here who will join me on screen to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Diana. Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see some familiar faces from last week. Again, my name is Linda Stott from the Markham Small Business Center, and we offer a multitude of webinars and resources for small businesses on topics such as startup regulations, business planning, budgeting, financial forecasting, as well as numerous special interest topics. For Markham residents or businesses located in Markham, we offer more specialized assistance such as one-on-one consultations and access to grant funding opportunities. But as I just saw, there are many of you from not within Markham, and that's okay. Please do visit our website. You're welcome to a lot of those resources there. So if you have any questions for me, I will be monitoring the chat this evening, so feel free to write me there, or you can write me at my email, which is msbc@markham.ca, and our website is markham.ca/msbc. And I'll be sure to put all that in the chat. So thank you very much and enjoy your evening. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you, Linda. So yes, again, Linda will be in the chat to answer any questions that you may have. Now, just for a few housekeeping, just to let you know, if you can keep your mics muted, unless you are asking a question, there is sometimes some background noise, so we do like to avoid that. And also, if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand. So there is a function in Zoom where you can raise your hand. So it's just located at the bottom of your screen. And you can also type your questions in the chat box. So if you're interested in coming on screen, you can do that to ask questions, or you can type it in our chat. I think that's about it. So I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Mark Evans. He's a principal at Marketing Spark, a fractional who helps B2B and SaaS companies drive more engagement, better prospects, and higher sales. Mark's areas of expertise include brand positioning and messaging, strategic planning, and managing tactical execution. Mark also produces a weekly podcast, Marketing Spark, that features 15-minute interviews with marketers. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here, at least virtually.
Good to have you. So you can go ahead and share your screen so we can all see.
Okay, I will. Thanks for, it's good to be here. So as Diane said, my name is Mark. I'm a fractional CMO for B2B and SaaS companies. So most of the companies that I work for are 50 employees or less. They've got product market fit, they've got customers, they've got revenue, which are all good things. But in many cases, product development and sales have outstripped marketing. And they get to a point where they want to scale, they want to leverage marketing, but they don't know how. They don't know where to start. And what they're afraid of is doing the wrong things. So that's where I come in with a variety of services. I work as a fractional CMO. I work on a strategic project basis where if they've got a pressing priority, they need some outside perspective, I can help them with that. I also do coaching and advisory work for startups that need a light touch. As Diane said, I'm good at brand positioning, strategic planning, and overseeing tactical execution. So my background is actually as a newspaper reporter. I was a business reporter, mostly for technology, for the National Post, Bloomberg News, and the Globe and Mail. The highlight of my journalism career was probably writing about Nortel all the way up and writing about Nortel all the way down. But what I really do is I help companies make the right marketing decisions. One of the realities of marketing is that there are many options, and it's easy to make mistakes or spend too much money on the right or wrong thing. So I really see myself as a trust agent who helps entrepreneurs and fast-growing companies make sure that the money they do spend on marketing is money well spent. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that they're focused on the right people at the right time in the right places. But here's the thing about marketing, and the right marketing decisions are driven by knowing your customers. That's the reality. Is if you know your customers, then your chances of business success are going to be that much greater. And in many respects, this is business 101, right? I mean, come on, we all have to know our customers, because if you don't know them, how are you going to sell to them? How are you going to market to them? How are you going to do customer service? But sadly, this is far from reality. And the reason is that too many companies don't know their customers. Now, if, like me, you spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, a lot of the content these days is around the importance of knowing your customers. There's a lot of marketers, very experienced marketers, waving the flag about being customer centric. And I asked myself, well, why is this? Why are marketers talking about knowing their customers? Because it should be something they do each and every day. And the reality is we take our customers for granted. And think about your own business. When you've got customers, when you're attracting customers, you love them, and you love them a lot, and you pay a lot of attention to them, and a lot of your marketing effort is geared towards getting them, attracting them, engaging them, nurturing them, and selling them. But once you have them in the fold, we often forget about them. We don't give them the love that they deserve. We don't pay attention to them. We forget to market to them. We forget to sell them to them because we think we've already got them. And as a result, they start to feel ignored. They start to feel forgotten. And then the marketers can't understand why their marketing isn't working. And the reality is they've lost touch with their customers. And that's one thing that that's a dangerous place to be as a marketer. And the reality is many of us don't love our customers. And that is completely puzzling to me as a marketer, because without customers, we don't have a business. And so we got to change that. We've got to change our attitude about our customers and our prospects. We've got to change the way that we approach customers and how much we know about them, how much we can understand what their buying habits are, what their pains and goals and fears are, so that we can do a better job of marketing and selling. So what we're going to do is we're all going to try to become more customer centric, because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. I have a philosophy that whatever I do from a marketing perspective is aimed at the customer. It's about them and their problems, their goals, aspirations. And I say somewhat tongue in cheek, it has nothing to do with you or your product, because customers don't care. That's the reality. And you may be saying to yourself, what do you mean they don't care? And what I'm saying is that they don't care about you, your product, your features, their benefits. They care about themselves. They're selfish. What they care about is what you're going to do for them. How are you going to make their lives easier, more productive, more fit, richer, more enriched, better traveled, all the things that are going to impact them. So what is it about your product that's going to deliver to make their life better? And then after you tell that story to them, after you market to them and sell to them, then you can get into the nitty gritty. Then you can get into the weeds about how your product works and the different features and that kind of thing. But a lot of marketing really has to be about your customers and nothing about you, or very little bit about you. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to focus on two things. One is around customer discovery, and the other one is around buyer personas, and they go hand in hand. The more you know about your customers, the better you can create buyer personas. But I want to offer a disclaimer before we get started, and that is that the customer isn't always right. So as much as we want to talk to our customers and find out what they want or say they want isn't exactly always what they need. And there's two great quotes that go to that. And one is from Henry Ford, who said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And the other quote comes from Steve Jobs, who said, it's not the customer's job to know what they want. So keep in mind that as you go out to your customers, as you try to discover who they are, how they buy, what features are more interesting to them, what are less interesting, you've got to also keep in mind that they don't know what they don't know. There's many products that they haven't experienced or have little experience with, but until they see it, until they taste it, until they touch it, they won't know whether they like it or not. So that's one thing in the back of your mind. Customers are gold. You got to know them inside out, but don't get too carried away by believing everything that they say, because they may take you in the wrong direction because they're only operating from their own sphere of knowledge. That's an important thing to say. So question number one when it comes to buyer personas, it's how many buyer personas have you created? Now, let's do like a mini poll. 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe Diane in the chat or David in the chat, people can put in the number of buyer personas they've created, and we can get a sense of, if you've done none, say you've done none, that's okay. If you've done one, that's great. If you don't know what a buyer persona is, well, that's good too, because that's why you're here. So what have we got so far?
We got 2, 3, we've got 4, 3, 3, 1, 0, 6, 2.
6. Wow.
That's the
Oh, I know
highest
the person
number.
with 6. That's amazing.
We got a
amazing.
few people that said 0 as well.
Okay, good. I mean, no, it's not good that they've created no buyer personas, but it's good that they're on the call. Okay, that's cool. Okay, so so what are buyer personas? And this is a explanation from HubSpot, and it's a semi-fictional representation of your ideal customer based on market research and real data about your existing customers. Okay, that's a nice marketing centric way of talking about buyer personas, but the simplistic way of talking about buyer personas, it's the people who really matter. So I said earlier, you got to focus on the right people at the right time in the right channels. And buyer personas have everything to do with the right people, because you cannot be all things to all people. As much as you want to sell your product to as many people as possible, there are lots of people out there who are not going to be interested in your product at all. Not because it's not a good product, but simply because it's not something that they need. It doesn't meet their interest. So what we want to do with buyer personas, we want to really boil down the ocean. We want to focus on the people who would be interested in buying your product or would be interested in advocating for your product. Not everyone has to be a consumer. They can also be an evangelist as well. So those are the things that we need to focus on. So why do buyer personas matter? Well, it's fairly straightforward, but let's go through a few of the major reasons why you need to focus on creating buyer personas. And one thing I should say before we go forward is that if you've got questions along the way, feel free to ask them in the chat. Diane or David, you can step up and just ping me and let me know. But I want to make this fairly interactive. It can be as interactive as you want to be. You can ask a question now, or you can wait until the end of the presentation. It's really up to you. So why do buyer personas matter? Number one, it provides intelligence about your customers, their problems, goals, and how they make purchases. It's marketing 101, but it does give you the insight into knowing what makes your customers tick, because we can't assume that all our customers look and feel and act the same. So one group of customers may act slightly different from another group of customers and use your product in different ways, even though they may, from the outside looking in, look fairly similar. So what we want is as much intelligence as possible about how they behave. Where do they do research? What kind of offers attract them? What don't they like? What are the competitive alternatives? All the things that you need to know to start to get a better idea of who your customers are and how to attract them. Number two would be, it allows your marketing and sales to be more focused and effective. Again, it goes back to my original thesis about doing the right kind of marketing, doing marketing that's going to drive ROI, because I've come across too many clients who have spent too much money focused on doing the wrong things, and they get frustrated with marketing, and the gut reaction when you do that is that they cut back on their marketing, or they don't do any marketing at all. And that is a death knell for entrepreneurs and small businesses, is that if you don't believe in marketing, if you stop doing marketing, then your prospects for growth are going to evaporate. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic here, but I am trying to be realistic in the sense that marketing is often seen as a necessary evil, a nice to have versus a need to have. And the one thing I do want to emphasize is that it's part of the pillars. It's as important as product, as sales, as customer service. You've got to have everything in place if you're going to create a well-run business. Number three would be buyer personas ensure that everyone is focused on who matters and why. So within your organization, you've all got to be reading off the same page. You cannot have people believing in different versions of the truth, because it's the same with your branding and your positioning, is you can't have people saying different things to different people. And the same thing goes with your prospects and customers. You've got to know inside out who they are. And everyone in your organization needs to know who they are, so that you're focused on saying the right things, marketing in the right way, selling in the right way. And so if you've got a really good sense of your customers, then all the things that you do to try to attract, engage, nurture, and sell are going to be a lot more effective. And finally, and this goes back to my roots as a reporter and a brand storyteller, is that buyer personas propel your brand storytelling. And brand storytelling, in my mind, means more than ever, because people these days, particularly, are distracted, multitasking, working harder than ever, probably doing more with less, if not the same. So they don't have the time anymore to browse. They're time strapped. And if you're not telling good brand stories, then your chances of attracting the spotlight are going to be that much less. So if you have good buyer personas, well-defined buyer personas, then you can craft stories that are going to resonate. And those stories are going to be far more effective, and they're going to drive your marketing, and they're going to drive your sales.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a difference between buyer personas versus pen portraits? If different, what are the different functions?
Buyer personas and personas are basically the same thing. Pen functions, that's a new one to me. Been marketing for a long time. I've never heard that phrase, but personas are essentially, it can not only be about your buyer, it can be about your customers, it can be about different people within the organization, but personas, for the most part, as far as a marketing perspective, they talk about buyer personas. Any other questions? Are we good?
No, I think we are good.
Okay, great. So the other reason why buyer personas matter is that, if you're familiar with the marketing funnel, is that there are buyers and prospects behave differently in different parts of the funnel. So when you've got that awareness stage where they don't know about you, and you've got to relay certain information about your product and your brand and your purpose and your mission, then buyer personas are going to help you create marketing and sales that are going to drive awareness. The same goes for interest. So you've attracted someone's attention, they're interested in learning more. So you've got to know what their needs are. You've got to understand what they're looking to do, what success looks like, what failure looks like, what their competitive options are. So again, it goes back to the intelligence you have about your buyer. And then when it comes to decision making, how do they make decisions? Who's involved in the decision-making process? Do they do it by themselves? Do they do it by a group? How important is price? How long do they take to make decisions? So again, the more you know about your buyers, the more effective you're going to be. And finally, it's about action, making that purchase decision. So all through the sales funnel, buyer personas are going to provide you with the guidance you need to say the right things at the right time, and, as important, do the right things at the right time. The other thing to remember when it comes to buyer personas is that there are different types of buyers within the corporate environment. So particularly if you're selling into the enterprise, you can have people who are decision makers who ultimately make the decision whether to buy or not. You've got influencers who are the people who do a lot of the research, do a lot of the competitive analysis. You've got researchers and you've got gatekeepers. And these people have different motivations. They behave in different ways. They consume different types of information. And so you've got to have buyer personas, in many cases, for all of these people, if you're going to do marketing and sales that are relevant to them. And that's the whole thing. It comes down to relevance. And so it's really comes down to deciding how many buyer personas you're going to have. Now, it's interesting in the audience tonight that you've got people who have 0 to people who have 6. And to be honest with you, 6 is probably the most buyer personas that I've heard of. So that person who was with that company must have a very diverse set of customers, or has done a really amazing job of slicing and dicing their customers into certain segments. I'd be interested in the chat if they're willing to offer up some comment about why they decided to create 6 buyer personas, because that's a lot of buyer personas, to be honest with you. In my mind, you're probably looking at 2 or 3. You can probably get away with 2. 3 is pretty good, and if you have 4, that's really good. 6 is on the extreme end. Not to say it's bad, and 0 is obviously not a good thing, because if you don't have a buyer persona, then you're essentially guessing at who your customers are, and that is a terrible place to be from a sales and marketing perspective.
So we've got another question in the chat, actually the same question from 2 people. So how do you define buyer personas for a child and father for a child-focused product? Who is who?
Right. So you can have, so in that that's an interesting question, because ultimately the father is a decision maker. So you've got to create a buyer persona around the decision maker. So that person's going to do research. They're the ones who are actually going to make the purchase. So you've got to learn about their buying behavior. Like ultimately, the kid could say, "I want a new Nintendo," but the father is probably going to do research in terms of, where do I buy it? How much does it cost? Do I buy a Nintendo versus a PlayStation? So you've got to create a buyer persona for the father, but also create a buyer persona for the child. So what are the child's motivations? What are their alternatives? What's important to them? And it may not be anything to do with price. It may have everything to do with the number of games they can buy, or how popular it is. So you've got to have specific buyer personas for those 2 key stakeholders. Answer your question? Okay. So what does a buyer persona look like? And this is a really interesting exercise, because there's multiple ways that you can create buyer personas, but I'm going to show you 3. Not to say that you can't do variations on a theme, or you can't have buyer personas that are dramatically different from what I'm going to show you, but I'm going to show you 3 that really sort of would probably cover a lot of the landscape. Number 1 is something that's short and sweet, right? So essentially what you're trying to do is get a snapshot of your prospect or customer. So this person is single, they're 30 to 50, which is a pretty broad range for a buyer persona. They live within X miles of this, in this case, it's an animal shelter. So it's a bit of background about what their goals are, what their challenges are, and how you can help them. And this, at the very least, gives you a snapshot of who you need to focus on. If you haven't created a buyer persona and you want to get started, this would be a good place to go. This would be a good place to be. You could probably create this fairly quickly, simply based on anecdotal evidence of who your customers are or people that you've talked to, and suddenly you have a buyer persona. Because a lot of things in marketing, a lot of marketing is hypothesis, they're experiments, they're lines in the sand, and over time you will iterate and improve everything, including your buyer persona. So that's one approach. The second approach is something a lot more detailed, where you get into social demographics, you get into their goals and their values, you get into their role within a company. What are their responsibilities? What does success look like? How do they make decisions? What kind of media and content do they consume? And even into their preferences and objections. What would excite them about your product? What would make them say no about your product? And then you delve into the online activity, like how do they do research? Where do they actually make purchase? Who actually influences the purchase? Is it them or is it something else? So that's another way that you can go. And the third way is simply by having a poster on an office wall. And in this case, this is MailChimp. I'm sure people are familiar with one of the world's most popular email marketing services. And what they've done is they've used a very creative way to identify 2 of their buyer personas. And they've created these giant posters on the walls of their office in Atlanta. So it's one way of reminding your employees about who matters to them, because that's one of the things you have to think about, is that it's not always marketers who need to be cognizant of who matters. It's got to be people in sales, customer service, customer success, product development. So everybody needs to know, like, at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're trying to create products and sell products that meet the needs of these people. So these are just 3 ways that you can go. So the next thing would be, how do you create buyer personas? So the place to start in this situation is focusing on the customer. Now, the first one was fairly simple, but I think the easiest way to do this is you focus on the customer who loves your product. This is somebody who gets tremendous value out of their product. They advocate for it. They recommend it to friends. This is the customer that you would love to have, and you'd love to have lots and lots of these customers because they see the value. They're a loyal customer, and they're going to buy again and again and again. And so, a simple template that you can use is something like this. So, you could probably put something together in a couple of minutes, right? What I would recommend if you haven't got buyer personas, or you've got one, is after today's workshop or tomorrow, is sit down and don't spend a lot of time doing this. Just write down what you know about your customers, what you think your ideal customer look like, or what you know about your ideal customer, and then you can instantly get a snapshot of a buyer persona. And from here, what you can do is you can then start to build out your buyer persona as much as you want. You can add as much information as you want based on what you know, and as well what you're going to know as you go and do customer discovery. So here is just a basic template that you can use to do a buyer persona. And
So
so,
Mark, sorry
yes.
to interrupt. We do have two audience questions, and they're sort of relating to the previous slide that you had. When you do sell to businesses B2B, do you create buyer personas for them? And will it be based on the characteristics of the business or the actual decision maker?
I will create buyer personas, but it's not just decision makers. It often has to do with people who are influencers. So influencers could be people who do the actual research. So if you think about it, a decision maker, whether it's the CEO or the CMO or the head of sales or the head of IT, they're usually not the person who's going to do the research. They'll suggest, for example, that we need a new type of email marketing software. So they'll get somebody to do the research, to look at the competitive options. They'll do they do the grunt work. They read the ebooks, they read the white papers, they visit websites, they try to get as much information as they can. And ultimately what their job is to bring the information back to the decision maker. So what they'll do is they'll bring a one pager, a summary, they'll line up some demos. But at the end of the day, the decision maker will go through the information that they need after all the other work has been done, and they'll ultimately make the decision about who they're going to buy. And that could involve them looking at a couple demos, going on a couple sales calls, but they won't do a lot of the work. So you've got to create, at the very least, you got to create buyer personas in the B2B environment for the influencer and the ultimate decision maker. And actually, and then you think about it, what you also want to think about is make a buyer persona for the ultimate user. At the end of the day, who's the person who's actually going to use your product? What do they look like? What are their pains? What are their interests? Because at some point in time, you're going to want to talk to them, because in some cases, a buying process might be top down. So it might be the executive down, or it might be bottom up. Somebody with a problem who actually does the work, who then bubbles the problem up to a director, who bubbles the problem up to the top. So that's one way to look at it: top down, bottom up. And you might want to have buyer personas for each of those people.
That makes sense. Now we do have one more question from Linda. She's asking, how do you find the details of the buyer's behavior during lockdown, and where do we start?
That is a really good question, because we're not going to conferences right now, so we actually can't get into it. But I think, why don't we hold off on that question, because I'll get into some of those. We'll answer some of those questions when we look at customer discovery. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So if we take our template, and this is just to demonstrate the simplicity of what you want to do. So in this case, it's Mary Lou Sanchez. She's a female. She's 32. She's a VP of marketing. What keeps her up at night? Not enough leads. Her campaigns aren't performing, and new competitors are winning deals. That's simple, right? You can write that in a minute, right? What do they dream about? An influx of real leads, not just MQLs. A job with a company with a bigger marketing budget. And how do they define success? So leads that sales loves and revenue growth. Very simple. This is a buyer persona. This is a very simplistic buyer persona, something that I made up in a minute. But what I'm trying to say is that if you haven't got buyer personas, don't be intimidated by them, because this is a buyer persona. Now, it's a starting point. It's a buyer persona 101. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that create a buyer persona for your ideal customer, then create a buyer persona for a user, create a buyer persona for your decision maker, and they can all be as simplistic as this. And then you can move forward and create buyer personas that you think you need to drive your business to support your marketing and sales. So that's where we start. So who's your ideal customer? So not for today, but essentially what you should do is take a 30-second exercise again, right? When you get back to the office or you're on a Zoom call with your people and brainstorm, like spend 30 seconds to identify your customer and who they are. So simple exercise. It's all about, the workshop is really all about taking concepts and turning them into reality. So that's the purpose of these exercises. You should do them just because it allows you to sort of see things on paper. And once you see things on paper, then you can actually move forward and make them part of your marketing sales. And this is a more detailed buyer persona. And I'll share the slides, and I can share a blank version of this so that you can fill out this as part of your exercise. So essentially we talk about all the key pillars here: demographics, responsibilities, goals, pains, needs. So this really gives you a full picture of a buyer persona. So you want to do a full-blown buyer persona exercise, then you can use a template that's simple like this one, very user-friendly, and then you can start to fill in the different boxes and instantly get, or not instantly, but in a short period of time, really get a real feel for who your buyers are.
So we have another question from the audience. This is coming from Jay, and he's asking if nationality, ethnicity, or family background affects the buyer or decision maker's personalities.
It can for some products, depending on the type of products you're selling. You know, like let's say, for example, you're a Canadian company and you're selling hummus, for example, right? I mean, I'm just making this up. In that case, nationality or ethnic background may have a bearing on the buyer personas that you play into. It really depends on the product and who you're trying to appeal to. But it's different for every single company.
Right.
Okay. So the other thing that you can do to cheat when it comes to buyer personas is that you can use the templates that I gave you, or you can use one of these tools. So Persona app, Make My Persona is a really user-friendly tool from HubSpot. Extensio is a great place for marketing and sales templates. You can get pretty much everything there, and Userforce. So these are tools that you can actually go into, and you can actually online tools that you can use to create buyer personas. So, hey, listen, you can use pen and paper, you can draw on a whiteboard, you can do whatever you want. The most important thing is to actually create the buyer personas. Okay, so the next thing is really to identify the people who matter, because as I said earlier, you can't be all things to all people. You're going to spread yourself way too thin. Your marketing is going to be scattered, and you're not going to be effective because you're not focused. You're focused on everybody as opposed to the customer who's going to move the needle to you. So one of the things you need to think about is you got to get out of the building. Now, this goes back to the question earlier about how do you do customer discovery during a lockdown? And so proverbially, what we want to do is get out of the building. But when things get back to whatever normal is going to be, one of the things you got to do as a marketer and a salesperson and a product developer is you got to get out and talk to your customers, and you got to leave your building. We get very comfortable as marketers, as entrepreneurs, especially in a digital age where we can sit at our desk and we can think that we can connect with customers. We can use LinkedIn to talk to people and connect with people. But at the end of the day, and I read this recently in a great book by Terry O'Reilly called This I Know. And if you haven't read it, you should read it because there's some marketing gold there. At the end of the day, as Terry says, people buy from people. People do not buy from companies. And that the more that you can interact with people and talk to people and listen to people, the better your marketing is going to be. So that's number one when it comes to customer discovery, is that you have to get out of the building, and we'll talk about that. And this is a mantra that was popularized by Steve Blank, and Steve is a very popular professor at Stanford. And he says, there's no facts inside the building, so get the heck outside. And that's absolutely true, right? We can do as much research as we want online. I can watch as many videos as we want, but there's nothing more effective than actually talking to your customers. So the reason you want to get out of the building is for a few different reasons, right? One is you test a hypothesis, right? So startups in particular, and small businesses for that matter, and new products are hypotheses. They're experiments. We're making educated guesses on whether an idea, a product, a concept, a service is going to work or not. And the only way you're going to find out is by actually talking to prospects and customers. So you may have extremely smart people who have lots of experience and expertise, but their guess is as only as good as yours. And so the only way that you're going to get reaction to a product that you think is going to rock it is actually go and test that hypothesis and see if it works. The other thing you need to think about is you need to break your assumptions and your biases. So one of the things that we're guilty of as entrepreneurs and as business owners is that we believe what we believe. We see the world with rose-colored glasses, or we see the world in a particular tinge, and we operate in silos. And so it's very hard to get us to see the world in a different way. So one of the things that I bring, one of the biggest pieces of value that I bring to clients is perspective. It's the idea that I see the world differently because I don't know their businesses as well as they do. And I ask questions they may never ask. And I focus on things that they may not see as important, but are important to me. So you may have assumptions about your customers and your product and how people want your product or need your product, but unless you get out of the office, unless you do some customer research, you're never going to know that, right? And third is you want to gather insight and intelligence. It goes back to my original point about why buyer personas matter, is that the more you know, the better you're going to do. So the one thing you need to think about when you're going forward and getting out of the building, or you're going onto social media or using some tools, is you got to ask the right questions. So these are some of the questions that I developed. They're pretty basic, but you got to think about, what do you want to know specifically about your prospects and customers? Because they may not give you a lot of time. They may give you a chance to ask a question or ask a few questions, but you got to make sure that you're asking the right questions. So when you're trying to do customer discovery and you're trying to create buyer personas, what are the things that you absolutely positively need to know? So it could be, how do you research purchases? It could be, how much of our priority is solving the problem that our product addresses? Or it could be, what are your biggest problems? So think about that when you have a customer for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or you're asking them a question on social media, or you're on LinkedIn, is what do you want to know right away? Like, what matters to you? What are your top 5 questions for your prospects or your customers? What are your top 10? So, because we're not going to get a lot of time to talk to our customers, and especially now, everyone's super busy. So if you have opportunities, then you got to do that. I said earlier, like, you got to talk to them. So the one thing that I will tell you about customer discovery in a COVID age is that it's all about conversations. It's still about conversations. And I've learned this firsthand. So I was a VP marketing for a software company. I got let go at the end of April, and I went back to consulting, which I'd done for 10 years. And so I didn't know how I was going to find customers. How do you find customers in the middle of a pandemic? So I jumped onto LinkedIn only because it seemed to be the thing to do. And I started posting content. And while I've posted a lot of content and got a lot of comments and people have connected with me, what LinkedIn has done for me is given me opportunities to connect and have conversations with people. And I'm talking about real conversations, like dozens of Zoom calls, telephone calls. That's how I've connected with prospects and customers. And to the person who asked the question about connecting, if you can't meet people in a analog world, this is one of the ways you do it. So if you're not on LinkedIn, if you're not leveraging LinkedIn to have conversations, not to connect with people, because to be honest with you, connections are easy. I mean, all you have to do is reach out to people, and most people accept your connection request, and commenting is easy. It's the conversations that are hard. So what I do is I use content and connections as opportunities to actually reach out to people and talk to them. And what you'll find is, because we can't go to conferences, because we can't go to meetups, is that people are pretty desperate to talk to people. And maybe desperate's a strong word, but there is an appetite to exchange ideas. There's an appetite to learn and to get different perspectives. And you don't want to be selling. That's the thing. You're not reaching out to someone, hey, I want to sell you a product. It's like, I'm interested in what you're writing. I'm interested in your viewpoints. I'm interested in seeing what you're seeing. And you want those conversations that you can use LinkedIn to make that happen. I've heard a lot of talk recently about people using Twitter as an engagement and conversation sparker. So that's what you want to do in terms of conversations. Face-to-face interviews, obviously when we have whatever, we can do that again. That's important to meet one-on-one with people. and the other is phone them. Like, one of the things that that really that I find surprising is we don't call each other enough. We don't phone people. We don't talk to them. And one of this sort of resonated with me. There's a guy named Stelly FT, and he runs a company called Close.io. And what they do is every time he gets a new customer, he calls them. And it's like, for one, it's like, it surprises the customer. But what Stelly says is that it enforces in the customer's mind that Close loves their customers, appreciates their business. But as important, what Stelly's doing is he's getting intelligence and insight from the customer. So he asks them, why did you buy our product? What alternatives did you consider? What made you say yes? What was the buying decision like? What are you looking to get from our product? So what he's doing, he is leveraging that early relationship to get as much customer information as he can. That feeds into his customer discovery, and that feeds back into his buyer personas. And the one thing I will emphasize about buyer personas is that they are iterative, they are fluid, and they are dynamic, and that it's not like you set and forget. You create, you evolve, you improve, you tweak, some buyer personas become less relevant, new buyer personas emerge, but they're a living, breathing creature. So that's super important.
So we have another, sorry to interrupt again.
Yeah,
We
no
have
worries.
another audience question coming from Emery. She's asking if you recommend doing focus groups to start the conversation.
You can do focus groups. I think when and if they're possible, they give you some great insight. Again, they've got to be done properly. You've got to have a plan of attack. You've got to know, what do you want to know? And the other thing is that you've got to be careful about making sure that you don't have a homogenous view of the world, right? You want different types of buyers, because not everyone looks and feels the same. Like, we're not like this amorphous group that we all act the same, we all have the same needs, we all buy the same. So if you are going to do focus groups, you've got to have the right group that's relevant to your company, and you've got to ask them the right questions. So yeah, there's value in focus groups for sure.
And we have another question from Vera. She has a hair salon, and she's wondering if she can ask questions when her customers are at the salon for an appointment, possibly when they're still sitting there processing their hair color for about 45 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest that people who come to a hair salon, especially if they're repeat customers, have a personal relationship with the hair salon. So you've got that connection with them. And so there's always good to give and take, right? You give great service, then you can ask your customers for something in return. So it's a casual conversation. You can ask them, you can give them while they're waiting for their hair to set, you can give them a 5-question questionnaire. You could say, hey, listen, we're trying to improve our marketing and sales. Can I ask you a couple questions? Absolutely, for sure. Hey, listen, if they're sitting there and they got nowhere to go, you've got a captive audience. And that's gold for marketers and for sales. So definitely take advantage of it. Absolutely.
Great. Those are all the questions I see in the chat so far.
Okay, great. So the other thing about customer discovery and buyer personas is that sometimes you got to get creative. Sometimes this goes back to getting out of the office, but this is more for inspiration, because I know we're limited right now, but I do want people to realize that, you've got to keep looking forward, and you've got to look on, like, what could we do over the horizon? Because at some point in time, things are going to change, and the good companies, the agile companies, are going to be prepared. They're already thinking ahead. Like, as much as they're concerned about the here and now, a thing about marketing and sales, you've got to look about what's around the corner. So how do we get a head start when we're allowed to actually get moving again? And this is a company called FreshBooks. They do invoicing software. They're based in Toronto. They're extremely popular. They've got millions of customers. And what they did in 2008, when they first got started, is they rented an RV, and the executives from the company did a North American tour where they went to Philadelphia, Nashville, and Columbus, and Atlanta, and they had dinner with their clients. So they actually took their clients out, and sorry about that, and they met them, and they had a captive audience. Going back to the hairdresser, you've got a captive audience, you're feeding them, they're having a good time, and you're going to ask them questions. It's not going to be in a very formal way, but it'll be casual conversation. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to do a couple of things. One is you're trying to build customer loyalty. You're trying to show your customers that you appreciate their business, you want to learn more about them, you want to spend time with them, and you also want to pick their brains. They're going to tell you things that you don't know. And that's one of the things that I've discovered as a marketer, is that when I do consulting gigs, I always ask my clients if I can talk to their customers, and they're always surprised by the things that their customers tell them, because they don't engage with their customers enough, and they miss out on a lot of great information about what they like, and as important, what they don't like. So that's important to do this kind of thing when we can, right? The other thing is to listen to them. And so when you're on, we have a tendency as business people to talk. We like to talk, we like to post, we like to make videos, but we don't listen enough. So you have to listen to your prospects at all times, and they'll tell you what you need to know, but you got to get those conversations going, right? So whatever you do to get the conversations going, whether it's direct outreach, or whether they're sitting in the hairstylist's chair, or whether you get a conversation on LinkedIn, you got to listen to them. And one of the services you might want to think about is Gong, which is a service that records your sales interviews. And so what they do is they actually use AI to help you figure out what's important, like what are your customers saying. So I'm not necessarily saying you have to use a service like Gong, but I'm trying to say is there's lots of different ways that you can talk to your customers, record the conversations, get transcripts, but whatever it takes, listen to your customers, because they're the ones who are going to tell you the things that you need to know. The more that you learn from them, the better you know your customers, and the better your buyer personas are going to be, and the more effective your sales and marketing are going to be. Social media, obviously, everyone's on social media a lot these days. I mean, social media, LinkedIn is more popular than it's ever been. Twitter, there's tons of engagement there. Like all the major platforms are doing extremely well, both financially in terms of user growth and in terms of engagement. People are spending a ton of time. So however you want to use these platforms are ripe to learn, to engage with your customers, to discover what your customers are saying. Like you can use, for example, some social media monitoring tools like Systemos or Keynote or Hootsuite, and you can do searches to see what the conversations are. What questions are people asking about your product? What companies are they talking about? What's important to them? What problems are they having, both with your product and with competitive products? So again, it's all about different ways that you can digitally get customer experience. Another tool that you can do with your existing customers are Net Promoter Scores. Very simple tool. What you want to do is you want to reach out to your customers and you want to ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely would you be to recommend our product? 10 being yes, absolutely. 0 being not at all. The groups that you want to focus on are actually the 9 or 10s that love you. So you want to focus on them and find out, so why are we doing so well? Why do you love us so much? Why is our product so good? The other group is the 0s, 1s, and 2s. They're your customers and they're in trouble. You're in trouble with them because they don't like you. For whatever reason, they don't like you, but they're still there. And so the formula for this is you add up your positive and negatives and you subtract the negatives from the positives, and it gives you a Net Promoter Score. So the higher your Net Promoter Score, the better you're doing. But again, it gives you insight into your customers. This is a very simple and quick exercise. So you're trying to do customer discovery. You can reach out to your database and ask them to participate. And the one thing you might want to add on, a lot of companies do it, is in addition to the score, what you can do is you can ask them, you can have a text box and say, any comments, any feedback would be great. It just makes it easy for them to leave a comment. They don't have to, but it gives them an opportunity, and you an opportunity to learn what they're thinking, what they want, what they don't want, what they like, what they don't like, right? So Net Promoter Score is a very, very simple tool. Big believer in surveys in terms of quickly trying to get information. I think a lot of us have done surveys where a company asks you to do a survey and you say yes. They might give you a $10 Starbucks coupon, and then you get there and it's 30 questions. Like no one's going to do a 30-question survey. No one's going to do a 20-question survey. Maybe 10 if you're lucky, right? Surveys are a great way to quickly get information, but try to be as user-friendly as possible. Again, it comes back to asking the right questions. And really, if you ask 5 questions, people are probably going to answer your questions, but make sure they're the right questions and make sure it's easy for them to use. So it's an effective tool, but do it in the right way.
On that note, Stephen is actually asking how about doing trivia as a survey? What do you think about that?
Can Stephen ask me, why would he do trivia?
Stephen, we're putting you on the spot here.
Oh, thank you. I'm just thinking. survey is probably quite boring and somehow make it like fun. So trivia is probably one way to make it.
Yep. Hey, listen, I'm all for creativity these days. I think, out of the box thinking from a sales and marketing perspective is the way to go, because there's so much coming at people these days. So that if you can do something different, interesting, and creative, you're gonna capture the attention. So if you want to throw a trivia question into your survey and you want to award a prize to the people that get it right, it could be a whatever, then yeah, absolutely. Like, have some fun. Like, I think that the thing I say about marketing, I may go a little off topic here, but marketing has to do, like, I call it the 5 E's. It's, you got to engage, you got to entertain, you got to educate, and you got to encourage, right? You got to do one of those, and entertain is one of them. It's one of the key pillars. So there's nothing wrong with having marketing that pokes fun at your customers or pokes fun at yourself, or it's just a little irreverent depending on your brand or product, because like, it's hard to break through these days. It's hard to have conversation with customers. So if you want to do that, absolutely go to town, right? I mean, everything, marketing is experiment. It may work or it may fall flat on its face, but you got to do it. Finally, what you want to do is do some user testing. So if you've got a website, if you're launching a website, or you're launching a video, or you're launching something and you want to get some instant feedback on whether it works or not, you can also use one of these services to get feedback, or you can do it manually with a focus group or things like that, right? The other thing is to drill into your leads. Like, as you get people who are talking to you about your product, like, question them, right? You don't just try to sell them. Actually try to pick their brain in terms of why they are interested in you, what they like about your product, what they would like to see, some of the other things, companies that they're looking at. But you can pick their brains, right? It's an opportunity. Like I always say, you don't ask, they don't tell you anything. So if you don't ask them, they're not going to tell you. But if you ask them, the worst they can say is, I'd rather not say. So I'm going to be open to that. And the other thing that you might want to do is, when you do get a new customer, whether it's a SaaS product or you've sold somebody a physical product, what you want to do is you want to onboard them, and you want to get as much information as you can about why they bought your product and what they expect to get out of it. And so you do want to educate them about your product. You do want to activate them and encourage them to use it and get value out of it. At the same time, you also want to say, hey, by the way, we're happy to have your customer. Just we're just interested in what made you pick us versus somebody else. So there are tons of different ways that you can do customer discovery, and they all feed back into buyer personas, which all feeds back into your sales and marketing collateral. So it's not to say it's linear, but it's to say that the more you know about your customers, the better intelligence you're going to have about them, and the more your marketing and sales is going to resonate, and that your companies are going to be successful. So I covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. We'll share the presentation with you, so that if you don't have it already, and if you've got any questions, that would be great. And if you want to get in touch with me, super simple. You can email me, mark@marketingspark.co. You can call me. I do answer the phone. Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. I post content on a daily basis about marketing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about marketing, buyer personas, or customer discovery.
So we've got one audience question so far from Jess. So she said that, I heard you mentioned about LinkedIn to connect. For a startup where there is no potential buyers or no email lists, how do you start?
So you've got to start with, you don't have any customers or email lists. How do you start? Okay, so one of the places, the first thing to do if you're a startup and you're developing a product is you've got to get a sense whether there's actually a need for your product. It's not enough as an entrepreneur to say, I think the market needs this. You've actually got to do research and discover, do people have the problem that we're trying to solve? And is the problem big enough that we can actually build a business and we can actually get people to actually buy the product? So that's step one. Step two would be to start to build a start to sort of frame out who this ideal customer is. Who's the person who's actually going to drive your business forward? So you can do that anecdotally based on who you think they are, and then start to build it out as you talk to more prospects. So you as a startup with no customers and no email lists, what you're trying to do initially is you're really trying to get a better sense of who you should be talking to, who you should be targeting. And that's going to happen over time. And you can use all these tools to make it happen. But then in time, then you'll start to build your email list. But it's a walk before you run kind of proposition, right? I mean, you really got to get that alignment in terms of, does this product make sense? Is it enough of a priority? And if so, then how do we go about building out that customer knowledge? And you're not going to get it overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over time, but you got to start somewhere. So that's my advice to you.
So we have another question coming from Cody, and they're asking, what are your thoughts on targeting businesses directly versus targeting marketing agencies that companies might be hiring to make their decisions?
I mean, I think absolutely you should target your companies directly. I think that buyer personas are a way of identifying people within the companies that matter to you. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out who are the decision makers, who are the influencers, who are the people who do the research around purchases, and go after them directly. In some cases, you might have agencies or consultants that will be involved in the process, and you may want to target them. But I would say that, yeah, it's direct marketing. Whether you're going to go direct sales or direct mail, or whether you're going to do social media or digital marketing, I mean, those are the people you're after. Those people matter, right? So you should definitely go after them directly.
And another question is, how do you create good survey questions? And are there frameworks or advice that someone can follow when making them?
That's a good question, because good questions depend on the type of information that you need and the type of customers that you have. But I would say that the best way to do anything when it comes to sales and marketing perspective is first do brainstorming. So no single person can come up with the perfect piece of content or the perfect script or the perfect number of questions. Is that it's a collective effort, especially if you're an early stage company or a small business, because we've all got as I said, we've all got our biases. There are things that we think are important. There are questions that we think that need to be asked, but you've got to do it collectively. Now, if you're operating as a solo entrepreneur and you're doing a survey, then you've got to really be selective. Like I would say, for example, think of think of 15 questions, then whittle that down to 10. And then whittle it down to 5, and really be honest about what you really need to know about your customer. And if you can only ask them 5 questions, what are those 5 questions you would ask them? That's a simple way of doing things.
Now we have another question. This question actually came earlier from Stephen, and he wants to know what your opinion is on the top 5 causes for failure for SaaS companies.
Wow, that's a loaded question. I could probably go on, but I would say, okay, number 1 would be there's no need for the product. And that seems like an obvious one, but you'd be surprised by when they do surveys about why that comes as number 1, because too many, okay, here's the thing. Companies are really, relatively speaking, they're really easy to start right now. Like, especially a SaaS company where you don't have to actually build something digitally physically. So you can start a company fairly easily. So, but too many entrepreneurs get lost in their own needs. They don't do enough market research. And so they launch products that no one wants, or no one wants to buy. And that they're just as bad as each other's. Number 2 would be not knowing your customers well enough. So you haven't done the research. You really have no insight into who they are and what they want. Number 3 would be, I would say that you haven't got effective sales processes. So you really don't know, even if you know your customers, you don't know how to reach them or how to sell to them. Number 4 would be that your product isn't good enough as the competition. Even if you got a product that people want to buy, it's just not that good because you just haven't differentiated yourself properly. You don't stand out from a crowd. So those would be kind of the top ones off the top of my head. But again, I'd go back to the original one, is that you really got to figure out, does anybody want this thing? Like there are lots of great ideas, but there are lots of ideas that look good on paper, but no one's actually going to build a business around it.
And we do have another question coming from Harshita. She is asking, once you have a customer persona, how do you use it in your tactical execution? Can you share some examples of how it can actually be used?
That's a great question. So once you know, for example, what your customers, what a buyer, what like when it comes to a buyer persona, once you know what the questions that that buyer persona has, like what are the top 5 questions that a buyer may have, or what are their biggest needs, then you can develop marketing that answers those questions, addresses those needs. So if you're going to be doing blog posts, then your blog post would be all about answering those questions and how your product solves them. If it's going to be about what their biggest pains are, then you're going to put their pains in the spotlight, and then you are going to help them figure out ways that they can that you can solve them or how they can solve them. And it may not necessarily be about you got to buy our product to do that. It may just giving them practical advice on how to make their life easier. So I would say that those are probably the easiest ones. And the other thing about buyer personas that really matter is knowing where they get information about making purchases. So how do they learn about the type of products that you sell, and more specifically your company? So for example, if you know that they're on Facebook, they spend a ton of time on Facebook or a ton of time on LinkedIn, and that's your target audience, that's where they do research and maybe may even make purchases, then you know that's where you got to be. So I always say that you dance where the party's happening, and that if it means that if you are focusing all your efforts on Facebook and you're not writing any content, then that doesn't matter if your audience doesn't read content. So that's probably the biggest thing to think about when it comes to buyer personas is the places where they hang out.
Another question that we have is, how do you validate that your buyer personas that you've created are actually correct?
Another good question. I mean, what we're doing in many ways is that we have a hypothesis. We are making educated guesses, or fairly, pretty good guesses on who these people are. And the only way to find out is you go into the marketplace and you start talking to your customers, the person who you think aligns with a buyer persona, and maybe you start just getting intelligence from them, asking them questions, asking them, the people that around a certain buyer persona, like, what are your biggest pains? What are your biggest problems? And if they give you different answers than the ones that you have, then you consistently get the same type of responses, then you know your buyer persona has got to be adjusted. So it really is, you've created something, you think it's on the mark, but there's no way really knowing until you talk to customers. And the other thing to know is that buyer persona is going to change, right? Like, as economic conditions change, a specific buyer persona, their buying habits could change, because maybe they're budget conscious, or maybe if the economy is booming, price doesn't matter as much because the company is doing really well. So it's a very fluid kind of exercise where you're always looking to update, improve, iterate.
And the last question I have here is, at what point do you create your buyer personas? Do you do it earlier on when you first come up with your idea? Do you do it after the product has been or service has been fully developed?
I would do it as soon as possible. So one of the things that a lot of early stage companies do is they do 2 things wrong. One is that they don't do any marketing, and they fail to actually start to craft a story about who they are and why it matters. So that's one thing. And the second thing is they don't do buyer personas. So they guess on their buyers. They have a rough idea of who they want to sell to because they love their product. They love the idea for the product. And so you want to, from the get-go, even if it's a basic template that I gave you about what keeps you up at night, you want to create one of those. That's a buyer persona. So you've got to write that down. You've got to get that sort of institutionalized, so that you build a customer-centric culture right from the very beginning. There at the very center of who you are and why you're doing it. And a simple buyer persona is a simple way to make that happen.
Great. Are there any other questions from the audience? Anything else that you would like to ask Mark before we close the workshop?
I have one.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I Well, I know that the market research is very important, but yeah, we're not a big company like IBM, so we don't have huge budget to all this market research. And how do we do it effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of it, if you're on a budget, a lot of it may come down to like using tools like surveys, net promoter scores, um, even asking questions on social media about specific things that you want to know. Um, Talking to prospects when you're when they reach out to them, like you got to do some down and dirty market research, and a lot of it has to do with talking and asking questions. As you maybe have a bigger budget, you can go to some small boutique agencies and they can do some focus groups for you. That's another way, another small step. So you can do a half-day focus group or a 1-hour focus group. But I would say use tools like online tools like surveys, um, net promoter scores, stuff that you can really like. Any intelligence you get from the get-go is gold, because they're the people that matter to you. Prospects and customers are going to tell you what you need to know. So down and dirty, and then as you get more budget, you can do some more formal things. I wish I could give you a better answer, but that's just, if you're a scrappy startup, you just got to do that. That's what you got to do. Like even if like when conferences come back, you may not have to attend the conference, but if you want to do market research, you hang out in the lobby and you just start having conversations with people, because you know the people at the conference are probably your target audience.
Thank you. So maybe I should ask around here.
So I see another question just came in from Harshita. For an ecom business that has a wide potential buyer set, any suggestions on how to narrow down a persona and make it very specific? Also, ideas on how to get responses. Are buying survey responses a good method, such as SurveyMonkey or Google Survey?
So in terms of buyer personas for a broad audience, now that's hard because anybody could buy your product. But I guess it comes down to maybe starting with, it could be down to focus sort of who is your ideal customer, because those are the people sort of at the core of your product and what are their needs and interests, and maybe trying to get a sense of what is the value that your product delivers. Like, what do people want to buy it? What are the competitive options? So you may not have specific micro buyer personas, but you may be able to sort of build a buyer persona about your ideal customer, and maybe some broader buyer personas that have more aligned with how your product fits particular needs, right? Because not everybody may use your product in specific ways. As for the second part of your question about surveys, hey, listen, I'm a big believer in surveys. If you want to incentivize people to do a survey by offering them a $10 gift card at Amazon or Starbucks, you can certainly do that. Depends on how much information you want to get, what your budgets are. You can also do draws. So anybody who enters the survey, you can offer, let's say, for example, you want to offer an iPad as a prize, like something that you think is going to attract a lot of attention, but it's got to be balanced by the carrot and how much information you want to ask them, right? So you don't want to ask too little. If you're offering something like that, you don't want to ask too much, because you may not get the responses that you want. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I just think you may want to make surveys as user-friendly as possible, so that people don't feel like they're have to invest too much time, because no one's got any time these days for anything.
So just to clarify, Harshita was, she just noted that she met survey companies that get responses for you.
Oh, survey companies get responses for you? Certainly, yeah. I mean, it's if you get the budget for that, and they can do proper targeting, and ideally they can help you craft the right questions, that would be great. But even if they can't do that for you, you're going to get better survey results if you do your homework before actually paying the money for them to do their work.
And we do have another question from Linda. So she's asking for the magic number. How many surveys can help me confidently validate my product or idea to start?
I wish there was a magic number. I mean, it could be 1, it could be 2. I mean, how many customer interviews do you need to do to know whether your buyer personas are accurate or not? I mean, I think the short answer, Linda, is that surveys are one tool to do customer validation, and but there are lots of different ways that you should also leverage to validate your customers as well. Because if you're relying on surveys, then you're getting a single sort of lens on the problem that you're trying to solve. So yes, use surveys for that matter, but use focus groups, ask questions on Quora, for example, another great place to do research, as mentioned before, or other social media platforms, talk to people on the phone. But yeah, I mean, like try to get as many perspectives as possible from as many places as possible is my advice to you.
And Needy is asking, how frequently should buyer personas be reviewed and updated? Should they be quarterly, yearly? And when marketing efforts aren't able to generate quality leads, any best practices?
I would say that buyer personas should be, at the very least, be reviewed once a month. I know that sounds extreme because how often do things change, but I think it's probably a good exercise, particularly if you're a small business or an early stage business, to continually test your assumptions. Is that you may have learned something in a month about customers, about what their needs are. You've picked things up along the way, and then maybe it's not such a bad thing to go back to your buyer personas and say, are there things that we need to change? Because it does allow you to capture your knowledge. Because if things are happening and you're just sort of, they get lost in the ether if you don't capture them. So updating your buyer personas may be one way to make sure that knowledge is captured and it can be leveraged.
Anyone else have any last questions that they want to ask Mark? Okay, so I think we will close it off. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing this really valuable information. Buyer personas and customer profiles are so important when launching your own business. And I think it was a really, really great session. So thank you so much for dedicating your time.
Happy to do it. Always happy to talk about customers and buyer personas.
Yeah, so please do connect with Mark on LinkedIn. His contact information is there if you'd like to ask him any other questions about the session or want to connect with him directly, you can do so there. I do want to mention I left a link for our 1-minute survey in the chat box. So if you can take just a minute to complete it and let us know how we did today. And if you have any suggestions on how we can improve, please do let us know. I do want to let you know that this was our 6th session, but we do have a number of different sessions coming up. Nope, technical difficulties again. But the next session that we have coming up is on November 5th, next week, on legal basics for entrepreneurs. And then we have setting up a Shopify store, social media practices, strategies, and best practices in sales. And then we close off with a session on pitching. So I do want to remind you to register for each session individually. And at the end of the last session in December, we will be having, sharing the, sending out the certificates of recognition for those of you who have attended at least 9 of the workshops. I do want to remind you to visit our website, launchu.ca, for information about our services and programs. You can click on the events tab to see all of the other free events that we have coming up. As I mentioned before, we do have our speaker series event that is in 2 weeks. So please do register for that. But that's it. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And we hope to see you again next week, next week on Thursday. Bye, everyone.